Okay, 3, 2, 1, broadcast.
Greetings. I'm Brooks Graebner, Chair of the Historic Hillsborough Commission, which owns and operates the Burwell School Historic Site. And handling the logistical support for this afternoon's program is our wonderful site manager, Kate Dubas. This afternoon, it is my privilege to welcome back to the Burwell School a good friend and former commissioner of this historic site, noted author and photographer, Chris Holaday. I first met Chris about 20 years ago when he was working on a book about Hillsborough for the Images of America series. Since then, Chris has written, co-written, and edited many other books, most recently a book about the restaurants of Durham. As a Dookie of a certain age, I was delighted to see mention of the Ivy Room and Anna Marie's Pizza. Chris is a native of Texas and an adopted son of North Carolina. He holds degrees from UNC Chapel Hill and North Carolina Central University. He is a member of the North Carolina Association of Historians and the Society for American Baseball Research. Chris has a deep love for the game of baseball, and by my count, he has authored at least 8 books on the subject. He tells me another is on the way. Chris also has a deep love of North Carolina history and culture. Today, Chris will speak from the intersection of these two topics and offer us a sampling of his encyclopedic knowledge of how baseball was played across this state and what it has meant to North Carolina from the time of the Civil War to the present. If you have questions you would like to pose to Chris, please jot those down in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to some of them at the end of the program. I'll also want to let you know about several upcoming programs we'll be hosting in the months ahead. Please welcome Chris Holaday. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Brooks. Thanks for the introduction. So today we're going to talk about baseball in the state of North Carolina. And it's a little strange talking about baseball since this summer is probably the first time in over 150 years it hasn't really been played in the state, unfortunately. But it has a long, amazing history. And so there's no way to really squeeze that whole history into an hour-long presentation. So I just tried to pick some interesting photos to show some of the people, the teams, the towns, just to give you an overview of some of the most noteworthy things in the state's history. So I'm just going to run a slideshow and go through it and talk about a little bit. I'm going to turn my video off so I don't distract from the pictures, and we will talk about baseball. One second. All right, so what got me interested in baseball in the first place in the state was when I was in school at UNC. I mean, I grew up in Dallas, so we had Major League Baseball, and I never really thought about minor league baseball or small town baseball. And so when I was in school at UNC, some friends just said, let's go see the Durham Bulls play. I was sure, why not? Let's go. And so we went, and I was just amazed by the experience of that, being close to the players and the sounds, and it was just so much different than a big Major League Baseball stadium. And the more I went to minor league games, just the more I sort of picked up little bits about the history of, the Durham Bulls have been around since like 1902, and other towns had long histories in baseball. So, and there wasn't really much written about it. So I tried to research it, and, as the more I discovered, I was like, well, something should be done with this interesting information. So turned it into a book. And so I'll just go through some of things I found. So first this picture, this is in Greensboro in like 1910. I just thought it was a neat picture. Baseball today at 4 p.m. And it was on the side of the trolley on a little sign. So I just thought that was pretty neat. And then the one thing I really discovered was how many different towns have had a professional baseball team in North Carolina. It's amazing. I mean, more than any other state, I believe, except for Texas, and which is a much bigger state. So, but nearly 70 towns have had a team at one point or another. And some of these teams only lasted for a year, but some like Charlotte or Durham have been around forever. But like some of the more interesting ones, like Snow Hill in Greene County, they had a team for 4 years. But the interesting thing about them was they were the smallest town in the entire country to have a professional baseball team. I think the population of Snow Hill in the late 30s, when they had the team, was around 700 people. But it lasted. And I mean, some of the people who played on that team had interesting careers. Aaron Robinson, who went on to be a catcher for the Yankees, he played in Snow Hill. And Walter Rabb, who was the longtime baseball coach at UNC, played for Snow Hill. And then another town, not much bigger, is Coolamy, which is a mill town in Davie County. And they sort of turned their textile mill team into a true professional team in the late 30s for a few years. And they drew a lot of people. And then Granite Falls, which is in Caldwell County, I believe, that mean they were another small town, right near Hickory. But the interesting thing about them, they also hold a record as the worst team ever in professional baseball. So they were 14-96 in 1951. That's a winning percentage of like 127, I believe. It's like no other baseball team anywhere has done as poorly as they did. But the more important thing about that team, they were the very first team to integrate minor league baseball in North Carolina. You know, previously, before 1951, all minor league teams were just white players. But at the end of the 51 season, the Granite Falls team was struggling so bad. They had no money. They were trying to find players. With like 2 weeks to go, they decided they were just going to hire the best black players they could find because they were local, they were available, and they did so. And that sort of slowly opened the door for that process to change over the 1950s. I'll talk more about that later. But I just wanted to give everyone an idea of how many different towns have had teams. And some of them represented more than one town, like Smithfield, Selma, or Newton Conover. And then some of these are not even towns anymore, like Leaksville, Spray, Draper, that combined in the late 60s, I think, to become Eden. So, and then next up, this is the first picture of baseball in North Carolina. 1862 is the Union prisoners at the Confederate prisoner of war camp in Salisbury, North Carolina. And this is such a great picture. Just even if it wasn't North Carolina, it's really interesting just to see all these people. And I can't imagine actually playing baseball like that because the guys are sitting right in the outfield, right beyond the second baseman. But it's probably not realistic. But it was just I think this is a great picture. And then next up, after the Civil War, baseball was a northern sport. It wasn't really popular in the South as much as it was up in New York and that area. But, by the late 1800s, it was starting to spread. And teams started having amateur teams to represent them and, play at special events. And so this team is from Yanceyville in the 1890s, guys all wearing ties when they played baseball. So that was more and more common as the 1800s drew to a close. And then colleges also started, having their own baseball programs. This is a UNC from 1900. And one of the interesting things about that is a particular player on the back row. Well, he's the third from the right in the guy with his arms crossed. His name is Archie Moonlight Graham, and he is actually the character that was in Field of Dreams, the Kevin Costner movie. So he was a real person, and he went to UNC. He was from Fayetteville, and he also later became a doctor, just as the character in the movie was. So he has a North Carolina connection. He did truly play one half inning of one Major League Baseball game for the New York Giants in 1905, just like it talked about in the movie. So he's a really interesting one. And by around 1910, tobacco companies were putting baseball cards in cigarette packs. Like the Honest Wagner card that everyone knows is sort of the holy grail of baseball card collecting. It's worth, $1 million or something like that. But at the same time, some cigarette companies were putting cards of minor league players in their packs. And some of those represented players from North Carolina. So these were a few, Raleigh, Goldsboro, and Wilson. And there were some other towns too that had cards in there. But also, one thing about these, they're interesting. The Library of Congress has really big, high-resolution images you can download of some of these cards if you ever want to print one. They're great pictures. And you can go to their website. I think it's just loc.gov, and you can find their collection of baseball cards. So this is the 1910 Fayetteville Highlanders. They were a minor league team at the same time as those baseball cards I just showed. One thing interesting about them is some couple of the players on there. In the middle row on the far right is a guy named Erskine Mayer, and he was the first true Jewish star baseball player, really. He was a pitcher, and he made it up to the major league shortly after this, and he won 21 games twice in the mid-19-teens, and no other Jewish pitcher would do that until Sandy Koufax over 40 years later. But he had a pretty long career, and his career actually ended playing with the Chicago White Sox in the 1919 World Series, the series that infamously some of the players threw. I mean, he was definitely not involved in that, but that was his final hurrah in baseball. But he was an important player for most of the 19-teens. One guy who was not in this picture, who was very famous, he was a guy who started the season with Rocky Mount. With 16 games left, he got traded to Fayetteville, and his name was Jim Thorpe. And he, in 1912, went to the Olympics in track. And unfortunately, when it was found out that he had played minor league baseball, he was stripped of his medals for not being an amateur. So, that was a common thing back then for guys to, even college players to play minor league baseball. They just obviously didn't use their real name, so no one would know. He just happened to use his real name, so it was found out. But he did go on to have a long career. He's probably America's greatest athlete in the first half of the 20th century. He played football, he played baseball at the major league level. So, he was an important player. But he did play for Fayetteville and both Rocky Mount in 1910. I wish he'd been in this picture, but he's not. And like all aspects of Southern society in the Jim Crow era, baseball was segregated. But baseball was just as popular in the white community as it was the black community. So this team is from Asheville. This is the Asheville Royal Giants in 1916. And I like this. I like the two guys sort of in the middle and their bow ties and their cigars. And this was a great picture. And everyone was kind of dressed up, all wearing hats and ties in the crowd. So this is the same team a couple years later, probably 1918 or 19, the Asheville Royal Giants. And these were semi-pro teams, meaning there was money involved with the players, but they weren't like part of a true league. They just played whoever would take them on. They might share the gate proceeds, or the owner of the team might offer someone, I'll give you $5 to pitch a game, something like that. But that was very common in semi-pro baseball, white and black. The guys just took all comers, and they would share the money. This is another semi-pro team from Kannapolis in 1926. In this team, unlike the Asheville teams, which were not really affiliated with an industry so much, in Kannapolis, Concord, in that area, there are a lot of teams associated with the textile mills. So this one was I think they were called the Kannapolis Towelers, actually, because the towels were the main product of the mill. They're not even all wearing the same uniforms, which is interesting. And so I think this is a great picture too, just because the people in the stands, like the little kids squeezed in between the players, peering through the chicken wire fence. And the guy on the right, on the back row, standing in the Greenville, South Carolina uniform, his name is Clem Llewellyn. He actually went to UNC as well. And he also, just like Moonlight Graham, got into one game in the major leagues with the New York Yankees in 1922. He's a pitcher, and he pitched one game. At least he touched the ball. I don't think Archie Graham even touched the ball in the game. He just stood in the outfield. But Llewellyn actually pitched. But he had a long minor league career, went on to be a president of several actual minor leagues later on in the 40s. This is Johnny Mize, who was a great player. He was 18 years old. He was from Georgia. He was 18 years old in this picture. But the thing I like about it is his uniform. And this was the Greensboro Patriots, and their uniform had a big Revolutionary War soldier in 1781 on it, the date of the Guilford Courthouse battleground. I just think this is such a neat picture. And Johnny Mize obviously went on to be in the Hall of Fame. He was a great player. He was one of many great players who passed through North Carolina on their way to the major leagues. This is another sort of semi-pro team, the Reidsville Luckies from 1934. These guys were affiliated with American Tobacco Company in Reidsville, and Luckies comes from Lucky Strikes, the cigarettes they made there. And so they just played in, industrial leagues, playing teams from other companies around the area. But the interesting thing about this one is on the back row on the far left is Wes Farrell, who was a major league pitcher at that time. He'd actually been an all-star in 1933, but he was in contract dispute with the Cleveland Indians, and so he refused to sign with them. So he just came home. He was from Greensboro. He came home before the 34 season started just to hold out. And while he was home, he signed with the Reidsville team for a few games, and he just happened to be there when they took this picture. And he went back to the major leagues. He got traded to the Red Sox, and he signed with them. Ended up playing several more years in the major leagues. And it wasn't all just guys who played baseball. These were actually a women's team sponsored by White Dairy Products of Raleigh, White Sir Walter Raleigh ice cream. And I don't know much about this picture, but it's from the late 30s, and it was some sort of promotional thing. And it was common for, women's teams to put on sort of exhibition games to bring fans, and this one was to promote a product. So I just hope they weren't required to slide in those shorts. But like later on during the war, there were true women's leagues, like the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, but that was up north and in the Midwest. It wasn't in North Carolina. This is a player I wanted to talk about. The minor leagues really became truly expanded in the state in the mid-30s. And up to the 30s through the early 50s was the sort of the heyday of minor league baseball. And there were so many people who played it. And this was a guy, I actually met this guy right near the end of his life. And he had an amazing career. He started playing professional baseball in 1934. And he played up through 1953, sort of spanning the entire sort of the golden era of minor league baseball in the country. But he was from Long Island, New York. And in 1933, I believe, he took a bus from Long Island all the way to Little Rock, Arkansas to go to Ray Doan's baseball school. And the picture on the left is actually a screen capture from a news video of that baseball school. And I found that video of that school, I think it was University of South Carolina, has all those news videos archived. And I just happened to see, watching it, you could see Norman Small, the second from the left in the back row. He was in the video just for a couple frames. So, but from that school, which was led by major league players, the catcher in the middle, I can't remember his name. But it was just tons of boys hoping to get seen by a major league organization. Small was fortunate. He was a pitcher, and he was seen by the St. Louis Cardinals, and he was signed to the Martinsville Redbirds. There's a picture on the right, which was their lowest level team, Class D, which was sort of the equivalent of like rookie league today. And he reported there in 1934, and he played there in 35 as well. Unfortunately, he was a really good pitcher, but unfortunately he hurt his arm. And the Cardinals released him after that because he couldn't really pitch anymore. But he was a really good hitter. So he was signed by the Cincinnati Reds organization to play outfield. And so in 1937, he was with the Durham Bulls, and that's him on the left there with the Bulls, picture he sent to his mother. And the interesting thing about this picture is the pants he's wearing are actually red. And there was a controversy within the league that year because the league president stated they weren't allowed to wear red pants because it clashed with baseball tradition where the home team always wears white. But the owner of the Bulls sort of ignored it and said the rules said that the team only had to white be the main color and you could wear whatever the team's primary colors were, which were red and white. So they did wear red pants for one whole year. And then, much like the movie Bull Durham, Norman Small got married at home plate. And that's on the right is sort of a program from his wedding. He married his wife, Sarah Sherrill. She was from Mooresville, and Norman Small had played in Mooresville the year before this, and he met her there. And she came to Durham with him. And he played in Durham a couple years, and then he went to Columbia, South Carolina, which was the next step up. And he worked his way up through the minor league organization. In 1942, he signed with the New York Giants organization. They sent him to Jersey City, New Jersey, which was AAA, one step below the New York Giants. So close to his goal of being a Major League Baseball player. And he was doing well in 1942. I think he was batting maybe 270 or something halfway through the season. Then, unfortunately, in 1942, he got drafted into the Army. And he spent 2.5 years in the Army, sort of at the peak of his baseball career. And that had to have been so frustrating. You're in Jersey City, you can actually, which was right on the banks of the Hudson River, you could look across and you could see New York City where, the Giants were. And one injury to one outfielder, he could have been called up at any second. But he got sent to Europe and all the way into Czechoslovakia, with his unit in the Army. And when the war ended, he was released and came back, and he signed with Mooresville, which was where his wife was from. They had a minor league team. And I guess it was sort of, he just decided to stay home after that. He didn't pursue a major league career anymore. He was a little too old, and he just stayed in Mooresville. It's sort of that, big fish in a small pond sort of thing, maybe. I don't know. And he was sort of the star of the Mooresville team. He was a home run hitter. And these three guys sort of made up the Moors outfield for a couple years, 49 and 50. Jim Mills on the left had a long minor league career himself. He actually had an interesting side career as an ACC basketball referee in the 60s and 70s. And then he was a minor league baseball executive as well. But Small played several years for the Moors, and that was his home, for the rest of his life. In 1952, almost at the end of his career, the Raleigh team in the Carolina League was, they were an independent team. They were not affiliated with a major league organization. So they could sort of hire whoever they could afford, basically. They weren't assigned a bunch of young players by a major league club. So they hired veterans like Norman Small and a few others, and they were a really good team because of that. And so Small was there kneeling on fourth from left on the front row. And the manager on the back row on the far right is Herb Brett. He actually was a pitcher for the Chicago Cubs in the 1920s. And on the back row, it's the fourth from right, the guy standing there. I'll tell you about him in a second. But he was an interesting character. This is the Goshen Red Wings. They were a black team from Greensboro. Goshen is a community on the south side of Greensboro. And they were a semi-pro team. And, it's easy to say the Negro Leagues of North Carolina, but the Negro Leagues were truly in the North and the Midwest. I mean, they were big things, the Negro National League, Negro American League. And in the South, it was a little less organized than that. And most of the black teams, they did what was called barnstorming. They just traveled a lot. They played any team they could find to take on. I mean, Goshen Red Wings had the home stadium, but they also traveled quite a lot. And this team, kneeling on the front row, third from left is William Davis. And he actually made it to the Negro National League. He played for, I think, Washington, Baltimore. He had a pretty good career. But the one who is the most interesting in this picture is on the back row, second from left, standing. His name is Charlie Roach, and he was from Reidsville. He was, he had played at North Carolina A&T. And actually, he went to Winston-Salem State University, or college at the time, but they didn't have a baseball team. So he was allowed to play for A&T, even though he went to Winston-Salem State, which was interesting. But in 1951, he became the first black player to be signed by the Coastal Plain League, which was a previously all-white minor league in eastern North Carolina. He was signed by the New Bern Club. And he was sort of a groundbreaking player in that league. And he only played a few games, but it did, open some doors for future players after that. And after baseball, he went on to become, I think he became the assistant principal of Durham High School, and he lived in Durham the rest of his life. The guy I told you about in the Raleigh picture standing on the back row Well, that's him, the second from left there. His name is Crash Davis, and you probably remember that name because if you've seen the movie Bull Durham, that's where the name comes from. Lawrence Crash Davis, he was from Gastonia. He went to Duke, and he was one of the few players who was drafted from college. He went straight to the major leagues. He played for the Philadelphia Athletics for parts of 2 seasons. He wasn't a particularly great player. He was an infielder, but he was decent. And then he went into the military during World War II. I think he was drafted I think he graduated college in maybe 1938 or 39, and then he made it to the Athletics. But after the military service, he got out and he was kind of too old to, pursue a major league career again. So he came back to North Carolina and played in the minor leagues. The guy to the right of him, his name is Bill Nagel. He was in the same situation. He had played in the major leagues before the war. I think he played with the Phillies and maybe the White Sox a little bit. And, he was another one of those players. He was sort of on the fringe, but, after the war, there were a lot of those guys like that. So they settled into the minor leagues and it was a good living. It was better than working a regular job. And I think Davis played probably 5 or 6 years in the Carolina League. He played for Durham, like the movie Bull Durham, and he played for Reidsville and Raleigh. I think Nagel also played for Raleigh as well at one point. This is Tom Alston. He is from Greensboro, and he's interesting. Well, he's important for the role he played in Major League Baseball integration. Everyone knows Jackie Robinson in 1947 played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but some teams were not as quick to integrate. Some teams were very slow. But the Cardinals, they were the first. Their first black player was in 1954, and that was Tom Alston. And he played at North Carolina A&T. He played for the Goshen Red Wings for a while. And he ended up in Jacksonville, Florida. He was seen by a team, and they recruited him to play for them. So he traveled with that Jacksonville team, got seen by another team, ended up playing in Canada. This was probably in the late 40s, early 50s in Canada, and he was signed by the San Diego Padres, which obviously is a major league team today, but at that time it was the Pacific Coast League, which was sort of its own separate major league in a way. And with San Diego, he was outstanding. I mean, he's like 6'5". He was a first baseman. He had all the potential in the world to be a great player. And the St. Louis Cardinals paid a reported $100,000 for his contract in like 1953, which was a huge amount of money. And he reported to St. Louis, and he made the team in 1954. And he did pretty well his first year. I think I can't remember exactly what his average was. He hit maybe 260, 270, just decent for a rookie. However, his career sort of went off the tracks after that. He suffered from mental illness. And, despite all his baseball potential, that just was his downfall in a way. And he had a couple different trials with St. Louis, but he could never pull it all together. And he ended up just going home. And the Cardinals wanted him to seek treatment in St. Louis, and he didn't want to. So he went back to Greensboro and sort of faded into obscurity for a long time. And around 1991, Joe Garagiola, who was the baseball player turned TV personality, sort of heard about Tom Alston and found him and sort of helped him get recognition again. It helped him get financial assistance too from an organization that provided assistance to older players who needed it. And Garagiola also arranged for Alston to travel to St. Louis to throw out the first pitch at a baseball game in like 1993. So he finally got some recognition for his accomplishments. And so he never really played, professional in North Carolina as far as I know, but he was an important person in the state's baseball history. This is a 1956 High Point Thomasville High Toms. And by the mid-50s, a lot of teams were really making an effort at integrating their rosters. And it kind of depended upon who the major league parent club was. Like I was saying with St. Louis, they weren't necessarily the fastest to integrate. They weren't the worst. But the High Toms were affiliated with the Cincinnati Reds, and they were pretty progressive as far as their integration efforts went. And this team was very well mixed, race, nationality, and age even, because the youngest player on the team was seated on the front row, third from right. That's Curt Flood. He was 18 years old from California. And if you know baseball history, he was a great player. He played for the Cardinals and the Reds in the late 50s and the 60s. And he became most famous probably for his challenge of the free agency clause in the late 60s, which even went all the way to the Supreme Court. But he had an outstanding season with High Point. He was the Carolina League MVP. He was great, and at age only 18. Seated to the left of him is Orlando Pena, who was a relief pitcher from Cuba. He also made it to the major leagues, had a long career. So this was an interesting team. And on the back row, standing the player third from left is Woody Rich. He was from North Carolina. He was 40 years old in this picture. And he had actually played, I think, for the Red Sox before the war. Then he came back, like some of the others I talked about earlier, had a long minor league career just playing in the minors. And, it's better than working in a factory or anything else. So he did it for a long time. This is a good one. This is 1961 in Salisbury. And if you know the group, the Pointer Sisters, the singing group, this is actually their brother, second from right. That's Aaron Pointer, their older brother. And they were from Oakland, California. And he came to, North Carolina, Salisbury. They were associated with Houston franchise. And so he had an amazing season in the Western Carolina League in 1961. He had .402. Was MVP of the league, and he made it up to the major leagues a couple years later with Houston, but he never really stuck. He wasn't, he just was on the fringes of a major league career. He was up and down a couple times. He ended up spending a couple years in Japan as a player. And but afterwards, his career took a turn, but it was really interesting. He became the first African-American football referee in the Pac-10 football conference in the 1970s. And then after that, he signed with the NFL, and he had a long career as an NFL linesman in the 80s and 90s. And so he was an interesting person. He was a great player in North Carolina history. I mean, getting over 400 in the minor leagues is an amazing accomplishment. And then sort of the Hall of Fame is sort of the measure by, of greatness in baseball. I mean, that's the goal of every major league player in the sport. 7 players born in North Carolina have made it to the Hall of Fame. And in this picture, here's 6 of them. So on the top left is Gaylor Perry, who's from Williamston. And he pitched for 8 or 9 different teams in the 60s up through the 80s. He had a long career. In the middle on the top row is Hoyt Wilhelm, another pitcher who pitched forever from the 50s up through the 70s, I think, a knuckleball pitcher. He was from Huntersville, north of Charlotte. Top row on the right is Rick Farrell. He's the brother, actually, of Wes Farrell I showed you in the Reidsville picture, but he was from Greensboro. He was a catcher, mostly played for St. Louis Browns. He played for the Red Sox and other teams. But he had a long career as a catcher in the major leagues from probably the 30s through the early 50s. The bottom right is Luke Appling, who was from High Point. He was a shortstop, played for the Chicago Cubs, for the White Sox, for years and years and years. It's a great shortstop. The only thing about him, he never really played baseball in North Carolina. His family moved from High Point to Georgia when he was a kid. But I did discover just recently that in 1980 for the Durham Bulls, he was their hitting coach when he was 73 years old. So he did have a connection to North Carolina baseball at some point. And then in the middle on the bottom is Jim Catfish Hunter, who was from Hertford. He was another great pitcher for the A's and the Yankees from the 60s up through the 80s. And in the bottom left is Enos Slaughter from Roxborough, who's the hustling outfielder who played for several teams, Yankees and the Cardinals. And he's in the Hall of Fame as well. So these are the main guys. But one guy I want to talk about is Buck Leonard in the Hall of Fame. And he was from Rocky Mount. And he was born in 1907. And his father died when he was young. His father actually died in the Spanish flu pandemic in 1919. And Leonard had to, support the family. He worked and he dropped out of school. Well, he didn't drop out of school. He left school after 8th grade because where he lived, there was no high school for African-American boys. So he worked several jobs. He worked in a mill. He worked shoe shining. And then he went to work in the train yards as a mechanic on trains. And he played baseball in his evenings in his spare time. And he was naturally good at it. And he was spotted playing there by a team from Portsmouth, Virginia. A traveling black team from Portsmouth was in Rocky Mount. And they offered him $15 a week to play with him. So he left and he went to Portsmouth, played with that team, traveled. And then from there, he was seen by the Homestead Grays, which was in the Negro National League. Great, one of the legendary teams of the Negro Leagues. They were based in Pittsburgh. And so he played, I think, 15 seasons with the Homestead Grays. And he had an amazing career. He was a first baseman, probably one of the greatest players ever in the history of the game. And finally, he was a little too old when integration finally came about. He was a little too old to be really considered for it. And, he never really played in, organized minor league baseball ever. He played in Mexico, I think, to end his career. Actually, he did play 10 games for Portsmouth, Virginia, which was a minor league, previously all-white club in like 1953 when he was like 43 years old or something like that, maybe 45. And he got a few games in with them. But he never really got recognition just because of his age, in the true major leagues. It would have been interesting to see what some of those guys could have done in the major leagues if things had been different. Like he played with Josh Gibson. Those two were like an amazing combination for years, in batting for the Grays. But after baseball, he returned to Rocky Mount, and he ended up becoming, I think he worked for the minor league team there as a vice president, and he built houses. He was a coach. He did many things after that. And he was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1972. And he was finally recognized. He was not a forgotten player like Tom Alston. He was always well known and well respected. He was even in 1997, shortly before his death, he was recognized by the North Carolina General Assembly with a motion to, for his accomplishments in baseball. But he's, perhaps the greatest player ever, born in North Carolina to be in the Hall of Fame. This is sort of my last slide. I just wanted to, I think stadiums are one of the things that I've always been interested in just as much as the game. And there's so many great stadiums in North Carolina and small ballparks. And a lot of them are still there. If you look, there's great ballparks. And obviously Durham Athletic Park, the original one, is still there. NC Central plays their home games there. And I love those old parks like that. And where else are there? I'm like, Edenton has a small wooden park, which most of them, the ones that are still around, were brick, but Edenton has a small wooden one that's still there, built in the 30s. Let's see, Greenville's is still there. Wilson's is still there. And Wilson's is attached to the North Carolina Baseball Museum, if you ever visit there. And there's other ones like Greensboro War Memorial Stadium was built in the 20s. That was a big facility. They played football and basketball. That was one. But this one was in Raleigh. It was called Devereaux Meadow, which I think is just such a great name for a baseball stadium. And I just look at this picture and I just imagine what it would have been like, on a hot summer night, and people packed in there, all the men wearing hats and probably half of them smoking. And it was such an interesting, scene to have been a part of that. But stadiums this stadium was actually torn down in the late 70s and unfortunately became a parking lot for city buses and trucks. So that's unfortunate. But a lot of the stadiums have been preserved. And if you look around, you can still find some. So I think that kind of brings me to the end of the pictures I wanted to show. I did want to say one thing. This fall, I'm going to teach a class, an online class through Duke, continuing education class, ollie@duke.org. It'll be about baseball in North Carolina, and it'll be a lot more detailed than this. I'll probably have a whole session on stadiums, a whole session on the black leagues, a whole session on textile leagues, so stuff like that. So it'll be a lot more involved. If you're interested, you can check it out. And also, I have a website. It's not the most updated thing, but you can contact me through there if you have specific questions you want to ask me. You can send them through that. And I will go back to making myself seen. And here I am, and there's Brooks, and we will go from.
Yeah, sure. So other questions may come, but one question that we got during your talk, Chris, was from Janie Morris. And the way she asked the question is, why did college players not use their names when they were, not use their real names when they were playing professional baseball in the summers? So can you talk a little bit about amateur status and semi-pro status and professional status and what those things would mean and signify for the person, as well as what that would signify in terms of the larger cultural import of those distinctions?
It was, I mean, sort of like, it's still that way now. I mean, you're not supposed to play a sport for money if you're in college, basically. And a lot of guys, if they were college baseball players, they would, you know, in the summer, it'd basically be their summertime job playing baseball. And usually for semi-pro teams where they would get a share of the gate, or, you know, the owner of the team would slip them a few dollars, but there was money involved. And technically that wasn't really supposed to be done. So, but it was very common. And so those guys would not necessarily use their real name, just so it wouldn't be found out when they returned to college. It wouldn't affect their eligibility to play. And with the case of Jim Thorpe, it wasn't so much, when I talked about earlier, it wasn't that. It had to do with the Olympics, because you're supposed to have been amateur. It wasn't that he was playing, because he was trying to be a professional athlete, but he was running track in the Olympics, which was a separate sport, but according to Olympic rules at that time, that was a no-no. So, but there were a lot of college players who played summer ball, and when there were, like, you know, official sort of sanctioned leagues that college players could play, and just like there are today, like there's the Coastal Plain League today, which is made up of, you know, college players during the summertime, but they're not paid. It's just for them to, you know, have practice and keep their skills sharp during the summer. So.
Right. So thank you, Chris. Now we have another question from Mark Bell, who wants to know what the current status of minor league baseball is in North Carolina today. How many teams are there?
Oh, how many teams are there? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So
I thought you meant because of the virus question, because nobody knows what the status is for minor league baseball at the moment. I don't know how many is in the state at the moment. I was like 13, I think. A couple have, it may be more. A couple have moved. I know there was one in Bowie's Creek. They were playing at Campbell, actually, but that team moved to Fayetteville. Or they were supposed to move this year because Fayetteville built a new stadium and they were in Bowie's Creek temporarily. I think it's still around 13 teams. It's like Asheville, Charlotte, Hickory, Kannapolis, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Kinston, Zebulon, Durham. I don't know. I'd have to count on my fingers to come up with it all, but it's a lot. I mean, it's one of the states with the most teams. I think California, has more, but it's still a lot.
Yeah. And here is another question. What are the prospects of a major league team coming to North Carolina?
I don't know. I mean, there's been talk of that for a long time in Charlotte and even in the Triangle area, but I don't see that happening. I mean, you have to have such a fan base for that. And, you know, there's even major league teams now in areas bigger than here, like the Tampa Bay area, which the Durham Bulls are affiliated with, that in Miami as well, that struggle. But, you know, I just don't see that this area would offer more than those cities. I don't know. It's a tough question, but I don't see it happening. And then you have to have the whole stadium thing. You have to have a huge stadium. So I don't know.
It doesn't sound like you're sanguine about those prospects.
No, I just don't think it's realistic. I mean, it's nice to think of that, but I don't think it's a realistic. I think AAA is a nice size fit for like Durham and Charlotte. It's still big. I mean, the stadium holds 10, 15,000 people. I mean, that's pretty big, and they're packed usually, and that's fair for the size towns they are.
Yeah. Thank you. Now we have another question, which is, tell us about the Hillsborough All-Stars.
The Hillsborough All-Stars. I actually had a picture from there I took out of my slideshow because I couldn't figure out how to fit it in. But they were a black team that played in the 40s, and they were one of the barnstorming teams. They played whoever. They were pretty much amateur, even though they probably split the gate proceeds, and some of these might charge, 25 cents a head to come see them play, and then they would split it amongst the players. But they were a pretty well-known team in the 40s and early 50s, and I wish I'd left that picture in now. It was a guy named John Whitted who played for it. They played in a field that was on Nash Street in Hillsborough, is where their ballpark was.
I don't know. That was going to be my question, was where did they play? So.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the site of it. I need to try to track that down. But I know it was told it was on Nash Street. But they played several years. I'm not exactly sure how long. The one thing about some of the black teams, they're just, information is hard to find about them. I mean, the mainstream white newspapers didn't carry much information other than maybe just a mention of a game coming up. There weren't box scores and things like that. So that was true for all semi-pro teams. They didn't really get a lot of coverage. So it's just more difficult to track down specific information about those teams.
But a team like the Hillsborough All-Stars, when you describe barnstorming, how did that? Can you give us an idea of how that worked? Your team would get on a bus and then travel from town to town, and then how did you announce yourself, and where did you go?
They put out advertisements, but what barnstorming is like, for instance, the mainstream minor leagues, they have a set league, like, in the Carolina League at that time in the 40s and 50s. Durham played Raleigh, and Greensboro and Winston-Salem and Reidsville, and that was Danville, Virginia was in the Carolina League. They played each other, and that was their set, schedule. But barnstorming, you could play anyone. You could play any team that would play you. So they might go to Asheville. They might go to Wilmington or wherever. They would just announce it in the newspaper. And I've seen ads like that. I remember seeing one. It was Goshen Red Wings playing High Point Red Sox, which was a black team. So they would just put a little notification in there, and people would show up. And, they just traveled a lot, those teams. And like I said about Tom Alston, he ended up in Jacksonville, Florida. It was a barnstorming team from there. It was just happened to be passing through Greensboro and played them. So that was a common thing, not just for black teams. There were a lot of white teams who did that too back then. So,
Chris, thank you for sharing all of this information.
Yeah, it's a really interesting history, and it's long, and there's so much more to it than that. But hopefully I've shared a few things that people found interesting and some of my favorite photos. So
it's been really well done and intrinsically fascinating, but also a window onto a world that doesn't exist this way anymore.
Yeah.
And so for you to help us to remember it, appreciate it, understand the connections, that this must have brought a greater sense of community for a team, for a town to have a team.
Oh, it was huge. And that was such an important thing. I mean, a team, semi-pro, minor league, whatever, it was such an important part of the community. I mean, that was where people gathered. That was their big social event in a lot of towns. There was nothing else. There was no television really until the 50s. Really. So baseball game was it. And no other sports weren't popular yet. There was no college basketball wasn't as big. College football wasn't as big. It was just baseball. So people gathered there, chatted with their neighbors, watched the game, and it was such an important part of American society, black, white, whatever. Everyone went to baseball back then. So
great. Well, I think somebody has just given me another question.
All right.
All right. This is a really good question.
All right.
What happened to the textile teams when textile mills began to close?
Most of them were kind of gone by then. I mean, the textile mill period when they were so big was the 20s through the 50s. And American sort of society changed a lot in the 50s. There's a lot of reasons for it, but baseball at all levels sort of died off a lot in the mid to late 50s. Textile leagues included minor leagues. You know, the minor leagues were huge in the 40s. And like in 1948, I think it was 48 different teams playing in North Carolina that were true minor league teams. But by like the 60s, that was like less than 10, I think. It had really dropped. And there were various reasons for that. I mean, some of them are interesting, like television was one of the reasons that people started staying home watching television. Another one you don't think about is air conditioning. People got air conditioning. They stayed in their houses rather than, you know, going out to the ballpark, maybe, you know, a little cooler at night in the ballpark. So there were a lot of reasons, but Textile League baseball just sort of went by the wayside, you know, by the late 50s, early 60s. And, you know, and it just was, by the time the mills started closing in the 70s, 80s, it was already not really a thing anymore at that point.
Thank you.
It's a long, complicated, you know, why baseball changed so much. Like I was saying before, like the golden age of minor league baseball was like the 30s through the early 50s because it expanded so much. And all of a sudden in the early 50s, it just declined. And it's studying that is something I've always been interested in. And in the 50s in particular, there's a decline. There's also integration of baseball. So there was a lot going on in the 50s. So it's an interesting period.
Well, we are blessed to have you here to study that, preserve that, lift that up, and we've got to do this again, Chris.
I hope so. I would love to talk about it more. I can focus on something else, and hopefully this is a groundbreaking thing for a Zoom presentation for the Burwell School too, and hopefully a lot more of those can be done as well. So.
You know, especially for what you were doing today, Chris, it's a fabulous way to allow us to see those great images and to identify some of these players, some of whom I'd heard of and a lot of whom I had not heard of. And
that's one thing that, you know, the first book I did was sort of just a town by town history of minor league professional baseball, you know, A through Z basically. But in doing that, I interviewed a lot of former players. A lot of the guys from the 30s and the 40s were still around at that time. This is in the 1990s. And a lot of them had old photos and photos that had never really been published or seen before. And so, you know, I copied all their photos and that just sort of led to more because I love those pictures and no one had seen them. So I just wanted them to be seen. And that's just like sharing them and talking about them. People can learn about them. So that's just fun that they're now available to be seen. So
great. Well,
and thank you. I want to also thank the Burwell School for putting this on. I mean, to Kate Dubas and to you and Fran McCullough for organizing this whole thing. I mean, this has been a great experience. So.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we, as you say, you are starting something that we want to continue at the Burwell School, which is to host programs over Zoom. So we have another one lined up for next month on Sunday, July 12th at 3 o'clock. So everybody can put this on their calendars now, and the information will go out from the Burwell School with more details. But we'll be pleased to have the first of our Year of the Woman offerings with Laura Mitchum, the director of the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at Duke's Library. She will be sharing with us material from the Lisa Unger Basker collection documenting the women's suffrage movement. So I hope we'll get more great pictures when Laura comes to talk to us. And then on August 8th at 7:30 at the Burwell site, we'll have our second annual star party on the Burwell lawn. And our guide to the stars is astronomer Jerry Vinsky, and he'll have his telescope set up. And everyone will be invited to bring your own chairs, quilts, blankets, and find a socially distanced perch with a great view of the sky. And this program, last year, it was a big hit for families. And we're doing it again. And it's a really good program because it is something that can be done safely on site. And so we're really looking forward to it. And it sort of picks up on something that Reverend Burwell did for the Burwell students back during the days of the Burwell School, where he wanted to teach the students the constellations in the sky. And he would take the students on clear evenings, either up to the top of the Masonic Lodge or up to the top of Occoneechee Mountain to look at the stars. So we're going to do our own variation of that, our 21st century variation of that instruction on August 8th. So again, thank you all for participating. Chris, thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning
sharing
in.
your information. And everyone stay safe and well, and stay in touch with the Burwell School. Thank you.
Thank you.